You want to know the thing nobody tells you about the day the ships came. It was quiet. Not movie quiet. Not that fake hush they put in films right before the explosion. I mean real quiet. The kind where you can hear your own blood moving in your ears. The kind that makes a grown man stop chewing his gum because the sound of it feels rude. I was 41 that summer. Crane operator down at the Haverson Container Yard, right on the water. Cold harbor gray most days, gulls everywhere fighting over nothing. I'd been doing that job 19 years. My hands knew the levers better than they knew my own face. You ask me to draw my kids from memory, I'd hesitate. You ask me to set a 40-ton box down soft as an egg on a stack 3 high, I could do it with my eyes shut. That's the man I was when they showed up. Just a guy in a yellow hard hat with coffee going cold in a thermos. I'm telling you all this because I want you to understand. When the sky changed, I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't anybody special. I was a tired man on a Tuesday. And I think that's exactly why I saw it for what it was. Let me back up. The first sign wasn't the ships. People think it was. The news ran with the ships because that's what made the good footage. But the first real sign, the one that put a cold finger down my spine, was the birds. It was maybe 10 in the morning. I was up in the cab, second cup down, and I noticed the gulls were gone. All of them. You don't notice noise until it stops, and a harbor without gulls is wrong in a way your body feels before your brain catches up. I leaned out and looked at the sky, and it was empty. No birds, not one. Down on the dock, my buddy Tomas was standing dead still by the loading rig with his head tipped back. He's a big, quiet Estonian, doesn't spook easy. He had his hand up, shading his eyes. I climbed down. My boots hit the concrete and the sound felt too loud. "You see the birds?" I asked him. He didn't look at me, he just pointed. And there it was. You have to understand, the sky that morning was that flat dishwater gray we get 9 months out of the year. And right in the middle of it, way up high, there was a smudge. Like somebody had taken a wet thumb and pressed it into the clouds. Round, dark in the center. It wasn't moving. It wasn't doing anything. It was just there, and it was big in a way that made my stomach drop because I knew, the way you know a stare isn't there in the dark, that it was very far away and still that big. Tomas said one word. He said no. Just like that, quiet. The way you'd say it watching a glass tip off a table, knowing you can't get there in time. I'm going to tell you the next part the way it happened, not the way the documentaries cleaned it up. The smudge sat there for 2 hours. 2 whole hours. Long enough that some of the guys started laughing about it, the nervous kind of laughing, calling it a weather balloon, a satellite, a Chinese drone. Long enough that the foreman tried to get us back on the line, and we actually tried for about 10 minutes before everybody just drifted back out to stare. Long enough that the radios started screaming. Not our radios, I mean the whole world's, every channel, phones lit up. My daughter texted me, she was 19, away at college 2 states over, and the text just said, "Dad, are you seeing this?" No punctuation. My kid always punctuated. That little dropped period scared me more than the thing in the sky. Then around noon, the smudge stopped being a smudge. It came down. Not fast. That's the part people get wrong. They imagine it screaming in like a meteor. It didn't. It came down slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world, like it was sure of itself, and that calm was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed in my life. A thing that big has no business moving that gently. It came down through the clouds, and the clouds peeled back around it, and it kept coming, and it got bigger and bigger, and the whole yard went silent again, except for one guy near the back who was praying out loud in Spanish, fast, like he was running out of time to say it all. It stopped maybe 1,000 feet up, right over the bay. I have tried for years to describe the shape of it. The closest I can get is this. Imagine a city turned upside down and stripped of all its color, gray-black, spines and ridges and these long curving arms that swept down and out like the legs of something that walks on water. No lights, no windows, No flag, no symbol, nothing you could point at and say there, that's them, that's who they are. Just this enormous dead quiet shape hanging over the water, and the water underneath it going flat and strange, pulled smooth like the bay itself was holding its breath. And here's the detail I'll never lose. It cast a shadow. Of course it did. And the shadow came across the harbor, across the cranes, across all of us, and the temperature dropped. You felt the warmth leave the back of your neck like a hand had been taken away. We were standing in the shade of something that came from the stars, and it was cold, and it was so quiet you could hear Tomas breathing next to me. He crossed himself. I didn't even know he was religious. Now I could spend an hour on the next few days. The panic, the highways, the president on every screen looking like a man who hadn't slept and never would again. The grocery stores. You lived through some version of it, or your parents did, so I'll spare you most of it. But I want to tell you about the messages, because that's where the truth of these things first showed itself, even if none of us could read it yet. They broadcast on the third day. Every device, every screen, every radio, all at once in every language. They'd been listening. They'd been listening to us for a long time. It turned out, longer than we'd had radio, picking up the bleed-off, learning. The voice that came through was calm and flat and weirdly warm, almost gentle, like a doctor with bad news he's delivered 1,000 times. It said they were the coalition. It said they had come a long way. It said Earth had been surveyed and selected. It said our world was rich and our orbit was valuable and our position was useful, and that we would be integrated. It did not say conquered. It never once said conquered. That was the thing. They were so polite about it. They thanked us. They actually thanked us for our cooperation before we'd done a single thing. And then the part I still hear in my sleep. The voice said, "You will find resistance unnecessary. Your species is fragile. We have observed your wars. We have measured your bodies. You break easily and you die in great numbers from small things. We do not wish to harm you. Comply and you will be cared for. You break easily." We sat in my kitchen, me and Tomas, and a couple of the guys from the yard who didn't have anywhere better to be, and we listened to that, and nobody said anything for a long time. Then Tomas, who'd broken his arm 3 times that I knew of and worked through 2 of them, who I once watched catch a falling pallet jack with his bare hands so it wouldn't crush a rookie's foot, Tomas laughed. One short, ugly bark of a laugh. "They measured our bodies," he said, "from space." "Yeah," I said. "They never came down here," he said. "They never stood on the ground." I didn't get it yet. I want to be honest about that. I didn't understand what he was seeing. I thought he was just scared and talking. But Tomas was a smart man underneath all the quiet, and he was looking at something the rest of us couldn't. He said they measured us from up there, floating. They never felt this place. He stamped his boot on my kitchen floor, once hard. "They don't know where they are," he said. "I need to tell you about the world they came from. Or, I should say, the kind of world. Because we figured this part out later after, when the scientists got their hands on the wreckage and the bodies and the few of them we took alive. But it's the whole story, really, so I'll give it to you now. The coalition was old, older than I can hold in my head. Thousands of worlds, hundreds of species, all of them folded into this one machine of an empire that had been swallowing planets since before the pyramids. They were good at it, frighteningly good. They had crossed distances that break your mind to think about. And every single one of those worlds had one thing in common. They were light. Small planets, thin worlds, low gravity, every last one. Turns out, when you do the math on how life gets going and how it crawls up out of the muck and builds ships and reaches the stars, the easy worlds win the race. Light gravity means you don't have to be strong to stand up. Light gravity means flying is cheap, means rockets are easy, means a soft, fragile, clever thing can lift itself off the ground without the whole world fighting it the entire way. So that's who came to take us, the clever, soft children of easy worlds. The species that ran the show, the ones whose voice we heard, they called themselves the Veth. And the Veth came from a world with gravity less than half of ours. Less than half. They were tall, I mean tall, 8, 9 feet some of them, and thin as reeds, with long, delicate hands and big, dark, wet eyes and bones you could have snapped like dry pasta. On their world they were graceful, beautiful even in the videos. They moved like dancers, like things made of paper and wind. They had never, in their entire history as a species, in all those thousands of conquered worlds, stood on a planet like Earth. Because worlds like Earth don't usually make spacefarers. Worlds like Earth are too hard. The gravity's too strong. The things that grow on them have to be too tough, too stubborn, too dense, and they spend so much of their cleverness just on staying alive that they rarely make it to the stars. We were a freak, an accident, a heavy, brutal, impossible world that somehow, against all the odds, threw something clever up off its surface anyway. And that something was us. We didn't know we were strong. How would we? We had nothing to compare ourselves to. We thought we were soft because we cried at movies and got winded on the stairs. We thought we were weak. We had no idea. The coalition gave us 3 days to begin integration. When we didn't, when instead the whole planet went dark and angry and started welding plate steel over everything, they sent the soldiers down. I watched it happen from my crane. See, that's the thing nobody believed about me later. I went back to work. I know how that sounds. The aliens are landing and Eli goes and clocks in. But I want you to understand the kind of man I am, the kind of man a lot of us were. The yard was my whole life. If the world was ending, I wasn't going to end it sitting in my kitchen waiting. And there was talk, orders, half-orders, panic dressed up as a plan, that the harbor was a strategic asset, and somebody needed to keep the cranes warm in case the Navy wanted them. So I went up in my cab, high up, best seat in the house, God help me. They came down from the big ship in smaller ships. Drop pods, I guess you'd call them, though they were more like long gray seed pods that detached and drifted down on these shimmering fields of light, slow and graceful, dozens of them, hundreds, spreading out over the city and the harbor and the hills. Beautiful almost. They came down so gently. Everything they did was gentle. That was their whole way of being. Light worlds make light touches. One of them landed right in my yard, right between stacks 4 and 5, maybe 200 feet from my crane, set down soft as a leaf. I should have run. I want to be clear that I know that. Any sane man runs. But I was frozen up there, hands locked on the levers, watching, and I think some part of me had to see, had to know what they were. The pod opened like a flower, slow, patient. And the soldiers of the coalition stepped out onto the earth. There were 6 of them. The first thing I noticed was the armor. It was magnificent. I'll give them that for free. Sleek and dark and seamless like wet stone, with these elegant ridges and a faint glow running through the seams. Helmets like smooth, featureless eggs. Each one carried a weapon, long and thin and clearly very serious, the kind of thing that makes your whole body understand you are looking at death. They stepped out one at a time. And one at a time they fell. I don't mean they were shot. Nobody fired a thing. There wasn't a human within 100 yards. They stepped out onto the concrete of my container yard, under the gray sky in the cold harbor air, and their legs buckled, and they went down. The first one dropped to its knees so hard I heard it. A cracking sound that carried all the way up to my cab. It put out a hand to catch itself, and the hand just folded under the weight of its own body, that long, elegant arm snapping at the wrist, and it pitched forward onto its faceless helmet. The second one tried to help the first and went down on top of it. I sat up there with my mouth open. The soldiers of the coalition, the conquerors of 1,000 worlds, were lying in a pile in my container yard, pinned to the earth by nothing at all, by the planet itself, by gravity, the same gravity I'd lived in so long I'd never once felt it. They were drowning in it. That's the only word I have. They were drowning standing still. Their armor was screaming, I could hear it now. A high, thin whine, the servos in those beautiful suits redlining, just trying to hold up bodies that were never built to be this heavy. On their world, that armor probably let them dance. Here, it was a coffin. Here, they weighed 2, 3 times what they'd ever weighed in their lives, and their thin, hollow bones and their reed-thin muscles and their delicate dancers' frames simply could not do it. One of them got up. I'll never forget that one. It fought its way up off the ground, shaking, the servos shrieking, and it stood. It actually stood, swaying on earth under our sky. And it lifted its weapon, that long, terrible weapon, and it aimed it at the empty yard, at nothing, at the whole hostile, heavy world. And it pulled the trigger. Here's where it gets strange, and I need you to stay with me, because this is the part the scientists got the most excited about later, and it's the part that won the whole war before it really started. The weapon fired. A bolt of light, blue-white, beautiful. It was meant to travel flat, straight, a clean line to a target, the way it would on their world or in the void of space or on any of the soft, easy planets they'd ever fought on. Here it dropped. Our gravity grabbed that bolt and pulled it down. Not much, but enough. The shot, meant to go straight, buried itself in the concrete 40 feet short, kicking up a spray of dust and gravel. The soldier's whole understanding of where things go when you let them go, every instinct burned into its training across 100 worlds, was wrong here. Just slightly, fatally wrong. Their drones, when they sent them, fell out of the sky. Built for light worlds, their little engines couldn't carry their own weight here, and they dropped like dead birds. Their grenades fell short. Their vehicles, the ones they managed to land, sank into soft ground that would have held them anywhere else and bellied out and sat there spinning their treads. And their soldiers, oh, their soldiers. Even standing was a battle, even breathing. Their lungs, built for thin, easy air and light, easy bodies, had to drag every breath up against 3 times the weight they were made for. After a few minutes of just standing there, the one that had managed to get up sank back down to its knees, exhausted, finished, beaten by the simple act of existing on the surface of the earth. I sat in my crane and I watched the coalition's first landing party defeat itself. Nobody fired on them. Nobody had to. The planet did it. The voice from the ship had said, "You break easily." We weren't the ones who broke. Now I'd love to tell you it was all that easy, that the planet just shrugged them off and we all went home. It wasn't. They learned. They adapted the way clever things do. They came back with exoframes, full-powered shells that could carry their bodies in our gravity, walking tanks really, and those were a different and much worse problem, and a lot of good people died before it was over. But that first hour in my yard taught me something I carried through the whole rest of it. I climbed down from my crane. I know. Don't tell me. I've heard it from my wife enough times for both of us. But I climbed down because there was a thing happening at the bottom of my crane that I couldn't see from up there, and it was pulling at me harder than gravity ever pulled at those poor doomed soldiers. There was a kid. A rookie, couldn't have been 20. New hire, started maybe a month before, name of Danny. Skinny, big ears, laughed too loud at everybody's jokes trying to fit in. Danny had not gone home when the ships came. Danny, like me, like Tomas, had come to work, because at 20 you think the safest place in the world is wherever the grown-ups are. And Danny was down at the bottom of Stack 5, frozen, 20 feet from the alien soldiers, with nowhere to run. I came around the base of the crane and I saw him pressed flat against a container, white as paper, and I saw the soldiers, the ones still moving, turning toward him. One of them was up on a knee, weapon out, and its faceless helmet was pointed right at the kid, and I could see the muscles of its situation even through the armor, could see it deciding. I did the only thing my body knew how to do. I picked something up. There was a length of mooring chain coiled by the base of the crane, heavy stuff, each link the size of my fist. The whole coil probably went 140 pounds, and I'd hauled it around a dozen times over the years and complained about it every single time. I picked it up like it was a garden hose. And here's the thing I didn't understand yet, the thing none of us understood yet. To me, it was heavy. To me, lifting that chain was an effort, my back telling me about it, my arms burning a little. I was just a tired middle-aged man hefting a chain. But I was a tired middle-aged man who had spent 41 years standing up against the most stubborn gravity for hundreds of light years. Every step I'd ever taken, my body had been fighting the same weight that was crushing those soldiers flat. My bones were dense as river stone. My muscles, ordinary human muscles, the muscles I thought were soft, had been built in a forge those creatures couldn't have survived for 10 minutes. I didn't know I was strong. I was about to find out. The soldier on its knee swung its weapon off Danny and onto me. I saw it move. Slow. So slow. To me it looked slow, and I didn't understand why, didn't understand that I was watching a creature fight 3 times its own weight just to lift a gun, didn't understand that in that moment I was the faster thing, the stronger thing, the thing that belonged on this ground. I just knew it was pointing at me now instead of the kid, and that was good enough. "Danny," I said, low, calm as I could make it, "walk backwards, slow, get behind the crane base." I heard him whimper, but I heard his boots move, scraping, slow, behind me. The soldier fired, and the bolt dropped. It came at me beautiful and blue-white, and it sank, our gravity pulling it down that critical hair, and it screamed past my hip close enough to scorch my coveralls and buried itself in the container behind me. I felt the heat of it. I smelled my own jacket cooking. And I was alive, because this world bent that shot away from my heart the same way it had bent every shot that day. The planet was fighting on my side. I just didn't have the words for it yet. It felt like luck. It felt like God. It was neither. It was home doing what home does. I swung the chain. I want to describe this honestly because it matters. I didn't aim. I didn't have some warrior's instinct. I was a scared man swinging a heavy thing at the monster that just tried to kill a kid. That's all. The chain came around in a flat arc, all 140 pounds of it, with the full weight of my earth-built arms behind it, and it caught that soldier across the chest. And the soldier came apart. I don't have a gentler way to say it. That magnificent armor, that whetstone seamless beautiful armor, crumpled like a beer can. The chain hit and the body inside it just folded. Those hollow bones, those reed-thin limbs, the whole delicate frame that was already at the absolute edge of what it could survive just standing up, it had nothing left to take a blow. The soldier flew backward 15 feet and hit the concrete and did not move again, and I stood there with the chain swinging back down on its arc, breathing hard. And the silence came down over the yard like that shadow had come down over the harbor 3 days before. The other soldiers, the ones still able to move, stopped moving. I felt it. I swear I felt them looking at me. Through those faceless helmets, 6 light years from home, pinned to a world that was crushing them, watching a tired man in a yellow hard hat tear, one of their own apart with a chain he carried like nothing. For the first time, I think, they were afraid. Not of our weapons. We barely had any pointed at them yet. They were afraid of us, of what we were, of the simple, monstrous fact of a creature that could stand up easy where they could only kneel and die. The voice from the ship had measured our bodies from orbit and called us fragile. It had never once stood on the ground. I got Danny out, got him behind the crane, then around the back fence, then running, and Tomas met us at the gate in his old truck with the engine already going. We tore out of that yard with the soldiers still pinned in the dust behind us and the great gray ship still hanging dead over the water. And Danny was crying in the back seat, and Tomas was white-knuckled on the wheel, and I was looking at my own hands. I was looking at my own hands, the same hands I'd used to set 40-ton boxes down soft as eggs for 19 years, and I was thinking about how I'd never known, how nobody knew, how we'd spent our whole history thinking we were the soft, small, frightened animals of the universe, crying at movies and getting winded on the stairs, soft, weak, fragile. and how we were standing the entire time on the strongest forge that ever made a living thing. Tomas glanced at me in the mirror. He'd stopped being white-knuckled. There was something else on his face now, something I'd see again and again over the next 2 years, on faces all over the world as it spread, as we understood, as we stopped being afraid. He'd seen what I'd done with the chain. "Eli," he said, quiet, careful, like he was testing the words. "Yeah." He stamped his foot on the floor of the truck. Once, hard, the same thing he'd done in my kitchen, only now I understood it. "They don't know where they are," he said again. And this time, God help me, I smiled. "No," I said, "they don't. I told you the first hour was easy." I lied a little, not on purpose. It's just that when you've lived through the hard part, the easy part gets easier in your memory than it really was. The mind does that. It sands the edges down so you can sleep. But the first hour was easy compared to what came after, and I owe you the rest of it. So let me tell you about the day they learned. For about a week we won. The whole planet won without firing much of anything. The coalition kept sending soldiers down, and the soldiers kept falling, kept drowning in our gravity, kept getting up just long enough to fire shots that dropped short. We started to laugh about it. God forgive us, we did. There were memes. There were t-shirts inside of 4 days, a cartoon alien lying flat on its back with the caption, "Welcome to Earth, hope you stretched." People do that. People joke at the edge of the cliff, because the only other thing to do is scream. I went on the news. Local first, then bigger. The crane guy. The chain footage had gotten out. Turns out the yard cameras caught the whole thing, me and Danny and the soldier coming apart. And for about 10 days I was the most famous man in the world. Strangers bought my coffee. My daughter called me crying and laughing at the same time, said her whole dorm had watched it, said she was proud, said please, please, please don't do anything like that ever again. I promised her I wouldn't. I wanted on the record that I meant it when I said it. Then the exoframes came down, and the laughing stopped. The coalition was old and the coalition was clever, and you don't swallow 1,000 worlds without learning how to lose a battle and win the war. They'd lost the first landing. Fine. They studied it. They studied us. They studied the planet that was killing them, and they did the thing that clever, soft creatures always do when the world is too strong for their bodies. They built better bodies. The exoframes came down on the 11th day. Not graceful seed pods this time. These came down hard, on pillars of fire, the way a thing comes down when it's done being gentle. And when they cracked open, what walked out was not a thin reed of a soldier swaying on the edge of collapse. What walked out was a machine. 12 feet tall, heavy, built low and wide and stable, nothing like the dancers' bodies of the Veth, because this wasn't a Veth body anymore. It was a shell built specifically to survive the Earth, a powered frame that could carry a fragile pilot through 3 times its native gravity and still move, still fight, still kill. They'd been beaten by the planet, and they'd answered the planet. Inside each one, curled in a fluid cradle, lay one of those delicate, beautiful creatures, safe, lifted, carried like a pearl in an iron fist. The first time I saw one move, I understood we were in real trouble. It walked through a roadblock the National Guard had thrown up on the coast highway, concrete barriers, a couple of armored trucks, men I'd had beers with. It walked through them. Not around, through. The barriers went over like dominoes, and the trucks got pushed aside like toys, and the weapon those frames carried did not drop short, because the engineers up in that great gray ship had finally accounted for our gravity, had finally done the math for the heavy world, and the shots flew flat and true, and the men I'd had beers with did not come home. We buried a lot of people that month. I went to 4 funerals in 9 days. I stopped counting after that. Everybody did. The whole world stopped counting, because counting was a thing you did when numbers still meant something, and the numbers had gotten too big to feel. Here's the thing about those funerals, though, the thing I started to notice. Nobody quit. I'd go to a funeral and I'd watch a woman bury her husband and I'd think, that's it, that one's done, she'll take the kids and run for the hills, and who could blame her? And then 3 days later I'd see her at the line, at the barricade, filling sandbags, carrying water to the men on the wall, quiet, red-eyed, but there, standing there in the gravity that had made her, in the only place her body had ever known, refusing to leave. I started to see it everywhere once I knew to look for it. The thing Tomas had been circling around in my kitchen all those days. The thing the coalition had measured our bodies and missed. They'd weighed our bones. They'd weighed our muscles. They'd done the math on how fragile we were and how easily we died and how many of us they'd have to kill. And they'd done it all from orbit, and they had every number right except the one that mattered. They never measured how hard we hold on. You don't get a species off a world like Earth by being clever. The clever ones, the light world ones, they get to space easy, and so they never have to become anything else. But to climb up off a forge like ours, to claw your way to the stars against a planet that's trying to pull you back down with every single step, you don't do that with cleverness. You do it with something else, something the easy worlds never had to grow. You do it with the refusal to stop. That's the muscle they couldn't see. Stubbornness, you'd call it on a good day. Spite, on a bad one. The thing that makes a man with a broken arm finish the shift. The thing that makes a widow show up at the wall 3 days after the funeral. The thing that built every wall and crossed every ocean and stood back up every single time this heavy world knocked us flat. The Veth came from worlds that never had to teach their children how to keep going when going was impossible. Ours had been teaching us that since before we had a word for it. I didn't go back to the yard. There was no yard to go back to. The whole harbor district was a war zone by then, the great gray ship still hanging over the water like a held breath, the exoframes using the docks as a beachhead. But I didn't sit it out either. I want to tell you I had some noble reason. The truth is simpler and uglier and more human than that. I was angry. Danny had made it out with me that first day. He came to find me about 3 weeks in, knocked on the door of the school gymnasium where they had a lot of us bunked, this skinny kid with the big ears, and when I opened it he just stood there for a second and then he grabbed me in a hug so hard it surprised me, and he said thank you, and he said it about 6 times, and then he said the thing that broke me. He said his whole family was gone. The exoframes had come through his neighborhood the second week. He'd been at the wall, filling sandbags, doing his part, and while he was being brave somewhere else, his mother and his 2 little sisters had been somewhere the coalition decided to walk through. Through, not around. This kid, 20 years old, big ears, laughed too loud. He stood in the doorway of that gymnasium with nothing left in the world but me, the tired crane operator who'd swung a chain at the right moment one time, and he asked me what we were going to do. And I'm not a soldier. I keep telling you that because it keeps being true. But I looked at that kid and I thought about the woman at the wall 3 days after the funeral, and I thought about Tomas stamping his boot on my kitchen floor, and I thought about the planet under my feet that had made me without my ever knowing, and I made the kid a second promise. I'd already broken the one I made my daughter. Might as well. We're going to go take the harbor back, I said. I had no idea how, but I said it, and once you say a thing like that out loud to a boy who's lost everything, you've got to find a way to make it true. So here's how a crane operator ends up in the war. They needed people who knew the docks. The harbor was the coalition's foothold on the whole western seaboard, and the brass, what was left of the brass, organized out of a half-flooded community college 15 miles inland, had a plan to take it back. They had soldiers, real ones, what survived. They had the heavy weapons we'd managed to scrape together. What they didn't have was anybody who knew the harbor the way the men who'd worked it their whole lives knew it, where the ground was soft, where the crane still had power, where a 12-foot machine that weighed 40 tons might find the ground wasn't as solid as it looked. Tomas and I knew that harbor better than we knew our wives. So they came and found us and they asked, and we said yes before they finished asking. And that's where I learned the second half of the gravity lesson, the half that won the war. See, the coalition had solved the problem of standing up. Their exoframes could walk in our gravity. But solving a problem and beating it are two different things, and they had only solved the easy half. Because here's what those clever light world engineers, doing their math up in the safe quiet of orbit, still didn't understand in their bones. On a heavy world, everything is harder, not just for the body, for the machine, for the math, for everything. Their frames weighed 40 tons. On a light world, 40 tons is nothing. Light worlds make light burdens. On Earth, 40 tons is 40 tons, and 40 tons sinks into wet ground, and 40 tons falling off a dock does not float, and 40 tons coming down a ramp gains a speed their engineers had calculated for a gentler planet and got slightly, fatally wrong. Everything they built carried the same hidden flaw as that first dropped shot. They were always thinking light. The whole empire thought light. They'd never had to think any other way. And we thought heavy. We'd never thought any other way either. We knew, the way you know your own name, that heavy things sink and fall and crush and gain speed, because we'd spent our whole lives in the gravity that makes them do it. So we didn't try to outshoot the frames. You can't. We let the planet do what the planet does, and we just made sure the frames were standing in the right place when it did. The night we took the harbor back, I was in a crane again. My crane, number 6, somehow still standing, still powered in the middle of a war zone. I climbed up into the cab I'd sat in for 19 years, and my hands found the levers, and they knew the levers better than they knew my own face, same as ever. Only this time the box on the hook wasn't a 40-ton container of car parts. This time it was a 40-ton container we'd filled with scrap steel and concrete and every heavy thing we could find. And the plan, the whole desperate, beautiful, stupid plan, was this. Draw the frames out onto the main pier, get them clustered, get them confident, and then drop the world on them. I'm not going to pretend it was clean. War isn't. Good people went out onto that pier as bait, and some of them did not come back, and I watched it happen from my cab, and there was nothing I could do but wait for my moment and hate the waiting. Danny was down there. I told him to stay back, and he hadn't, because of course he hadn't. He was 20, and he had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. I watched him run between the containers drawing fire, drawing the frames forward. This skinny kid with the big ears leading 12-foot machines toward the spot we needed them, brave in a way that made my chest hurt. 3 frames followed him out onto the main pier, 12 feet tall, 40 tons each, magnificent, confident. They had us measured. They had us beaten by their math. They walked out onto that pier sure of themselves, the way the voice from the ship had been sure when it thanked us for our cooperation before we'd done a thing. They walked out onto a pier we'd spent 2 days quietly cutting. And I dropped my container. I want to slow down here because this is the moment, and I've told it 100 times and I always rush it, and it deserves better. I lifted that 40-ton box up high, higher than I'd ever set a box, higher than the cranes are really meant to go. I swung it out over the main pier, over the 3 frames, over Danny diving for cover behind a stack of containers, and for 1 second the whole night held still. The great gray ship over the water, the fires on the docks, the frames looking up finally understanding that the heavy world had one more lesson to teach. I let it go. 40 tons. From 100 feet, in Earth gravity. The math on that is simple and terrible, and I'd known it in my hands since I was 22 years old. And the coalition's engineers had never once had to know it because they had never lived anywhere it was true. The box came down like the hand of God. It hit the first frame square, and that magnificent machine ceased to be a machine. The pier we'd cut, the pier already groaning under 120 tons of confident invader. The pier gave way all at once, and the whole structure folded into the cold harbor water, and the frames went with it. 40 tons each, sinking, because 40 tons does not float, not here, not on the heavy world, and the same gravity that had made me strong enough to swing a chain pulled 3 of the coalition's finest straight down into the dark. The voice from the ship had measured our bodies and called us fragile. It had built machines to survive our gravity. It had never once thought about what our gravity could be made to do. We took the harbor back that night. Not easy, not clean, but we took it. And when the sun came up gray over the water the next morning, that flat dishwater gray we get 9 months out of the year, the gray I'd cursed my whole life, the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, the great ship was still hanging there over the bay. Quiet, patient, the way it had been since the first day. But something had changed in it. I felt it the same way I'd felt those soldiers looking at me through their faceless helmets all those weeks ago. The ship was watching us differently now. It had come to conquer a fragile world. It was beginning to understand it had landed on something else. Danny found me down by the water when it was over. He was bleeding from somewhere on his head, not bad, and he was filthy and shaking, and he stood next to me, and we looked at the harbor full of wreckage and the ship hanging over it, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then he said, "How'd you know it would sink them?" And I almost laughed, because it was such a simple question, and the answer was the whole war. "Because heavy things sink," I said. "Everybody knows that." He looked at me. "They didn't know that." "No," I said, "they didn't." And I thought about Tomas in my kitchen, stamping his boot. They don't know where they are. I thought about the woman at the wall 3 days after the funeral. I thought about a planet that had spent 4 billion years teaching its children how to stand up under a weight that would crush almost anything else, and how the children had grown so used to the weight that they'd come to believe they were weak, soft, fragile, the smallest frightened things in the universe. I thought about how wrong we'd been about ourselves. I put my hand on Danny's shoulder, the same hand that had set 40-ton boxes down soft as eggs for 19 years. The same hand that had swung a chain and dropped a world. "They measured everything about us," I told him. "Our bones, our muscles, how easy we break, they got it all right." The kid waited. "They just never measured how hard we'd hold on," I said, "and that's the only number that ever mattered." The ship hung over the water, quiet and patient and watching. It was the coalition's move. We were ready.